and welcome to our next episode in our Sport, Leadership, and Social Change webinar series. This episode focuses on women, leadership, and sport, and it's part 2 because we had an episode a little while ago, but we'll be hosting another webinar on International Women's Day in March. And this will be a bonus feature with Allison Sandmeyer-Graves. But I want to welcome you to the series in its entirety first. We always start by acknowledging the lands that we are residing on as a university. At Royal Rose University, we operate on the Lekwungen and Kosapsan people's lands, the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities. And we always want to thank them and acknowledge the gaps in our history and thanking them and acknowledging them for allowing us to live and work and play and learn on their lands. At our university, we rely heavily on the old growth forest that surrounds our campus, the lagoon that we look over, and the mountains in the background to learn and remind ourselves of many of the core principles of Indigenous ways of being and knowing, and something we try to embrace in our learning, teaching, and research model as well. We also give thanks to the ancestors, the supernatural ones, creatures, big and small, hereditary leaders and matriarchs, for looking after these rich resources and cultural teachings of this beautiful land. This is the path that I walk on most days in my neighborhood. So I live on the same traditional territories in Cadborough Bay and Victoria, BC. This is Mystic Vale, and it is quite mystical. We go in here with the dogs regularly, but I always like to highlight that this is the path to my office as well on our campus out in Colwood. So I walk down this secret little path in behind several of the buildings, and I find myself in various locations for meetings or my office or whatever I need. But they're so similar, and I really like to share the parallel that we can find these mystical places wherever we happen to be. This is the Rose Garden. We also try to, honor and caretake our history on the lands at Royal Roads. We've inherited a very interesting and kind of checkered past, actually. It's evolved over many decades and centuries, really. This is our commandant's house where my office is, and I literally have to smell the roses every time I go to any kind of meeting. We miss our campus, of course, through COVID and the wonderful communities that we can foster and develop there. Our model, of course, really centers on that community-based learning. But we also believe in social change. And most of our programs, I would say all of our programs and experiences on campus are focused on transformational change within and then facilitating change within our communities and our world. And part of that is this exploration of sport as a vehicle for social change and leadership development. These are my children, my 3 kids, all loving sport and exploring the learnings that sport can offer. And I try as a parent, definitely we try as parents to emphasize that these are learning opportunities. And at Royal Roads, we reflect that as well, that wherever you're coming from, you've brought experiences and learnings, whether it's a professional setting, a sports setting, a musical, or an artistic community setting, you bring learnings, and we expect that as members of your cohort, being members of a cohort, that you're almost responsible for bringing that knowledge to your group so that everyone can benefit from your learning in the different contexts you've experienced. Sport for Society is obviously a topic close to my heart. I have a history with sport and competed for Canada for many years in the sport of rowing. And through that, learned so much. So many of these topics, I think, really resonate with me as an athlete, former athlete, and a master's athlete now, that you're learning about development of self and others and the world, of diversity and inclusion, how important it is to embrace diversity. And our programs reflect these principles as well. And then themes within each of the programs, like sport, reflect these same concepts of education and appreciating and valuing the environment, of acknowledging the importance of equity and human rights, health, media, communication, and peace. And so our programs center around these core topics as well. In my school, I operate in the School of Communication and Culture. We believe in the importance, obviously, of bridges, of building bridges. And that starts with embracing diversity, of minding the gap before you try to bridge the gap. This is the Japanese garden on our campus, and a location where a lot of people will go for those reflective walks or meet as a team or with your peers, to learn and reflect. And reflection, I love the pond as well because it really embodies that concept of how important reflection is to learning. And I went through this as an athlete, reflecting post-career, upon what I actually was distilling from my experience. So I really want to continue doing that, reflecting on what sport can offer the world. And we've partnered with Game Plan, which is uh, an organization that supports athletes post-career, helping them to identify career pathways and ways they can give back either to sport or other sectors. And this is Andrea Burke. She's a member of our national rugby team for many years, and she completed a master's degree at Royal Roads. But I think she just embodies the joy that's possible through these kinds of passionate experiences and all that sport has to teach us. In this episode, we'll delve more deeply into the power of sport to foster and advance equity and human rights, and particularly in terms of women. And I'd like to welcome our guest today. We have a whole hour with Allison. Allison is the CEO of Canadian Women in Sport. It's recently rebranded, and I'd love to hear about that actually, because I think it reflects the way that sport has also evolved, and this topic of equity in sport has evolved. And we like to think about learning these concepts or exploring these concepts in and also through sport. So the ways that sport has to help us learn these concepts like diversity, health, learning, development, and equity and inclusion, but also so through sport, but also in sport itself. When we're operating sport, how can we learn these things? And then through sport, how can it teach us, represent or showcase or promote these concepts as a sector, as a discipline, as an area of living and learning. So welcome, Allison. Thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled to have you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can just focus on you now. Thank you. And I have a few questions for you, of course, but I'd like to start by just asking you to introduce yourself a little further. I can read a paragraph off a bio sheet, but I always think it's really valuable to hear from people themselves, and for you to highlight what you'd like to share with us, what you feel is relevant from your background, your experience.
All right, well, first of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And it's always meaningful as we look towards International Women's Day. But this is what I do every day, and I love talking about it. So I'll answer your question, but I'll start with a little bit of the personal, and then I'll lead to the professional. So in sport, everybody has a story. Everybody working in sport has their sport story. And I think I have the privilege of working with people who have represented Canada and played at the highest levels. My story in sport looks a little different than that. And I think it's one that a lot of people can relate to. So I grew up in a small town in rural Alberta. I'm a farm kid. I have two sisters. And sport was always a big part of our lives. I think really influenced by my dad, who was a phys ed teacher initially, and by a mom who prepared us and supported us in every way possible, and who taught at our schools. And so she was always there so we could stay for practice and so on. My first sport was competitive skipping, which is a pretty niche sport that not a lot of people have had a chance to hear about, never mind experience. But like so many sport, starting with that sport and then leading to volleyball, basketball, and others, it was the reason I traveled away from my small town with my teams, first across Alberta, then Canada, and even a little bit internationally. It gave me opportunities to experience leadership at a really young age, as we were tasked with teaching kids at other schools and within our schools some of the skills that we had developed. It gave me community. I was a really shy kid, very introverted, really kind of keen on academics, but not really finding a great sense of belonging in my school setting and in my community. And sport allowed me to connect with people in a way that, in a space where I felt competent and secure in myself. And it gave me a real sense of belonging. So that was my start. And then, as I said, I branched out to other sports and kind of tried different things and figured out what I liked and what I loved. Some I played really with a lot of commitment. Others I just enjoyed every time I had the chance to come across them. And it helped me as I transitioned to university as well. You know, leaving a small town, moving to Edmonton was a big deal for me. And I didn't play varsity sports, but I got a job running intramurals. So I worked for Campus Rec for 4 years and played as many as I could. And again, found my sense of community and my sense of place in a large university through sport. My career, though, had not been in sport until I came to Canadian Women in Sport. I studied political science, international development, community development. So my career was really focused on social justice and social impact. And I got a lot of great experience really understanding how you create those sorts of things. It's not an easy process, and there's a lot of learning that comes around how you create big system change. So when I had the opportunity to work for Canadian Women in Sport and take over the leadership role, for me, that's what really connected me to the mission of the organization, was that this isn't just about sport. It's very much about sport, but not only about sport. It's about what sport does for people. It's about the power of sport, and it's about using sport as a vehicle to advance women in all areas of society, which really speaks to my why and what gets me up every day and ready to keep challenging the status quo.
Amazing. So many parallels and intersections, right? As to, yeah, I love the social justice reference. And thank you for giving us that background, because I think that is so in line with, you know, declaring your stance, like where I've come from, and that small town piece I hear so much in sport. And also, I've been reading so much about stories of women, but I think it applies to everybody, of finding that community and also a sense of confidence through sport, for whatever reason, shy or feeling a little bit on the outside for whatever reason. I think we all experience at different times. So thanks for sharing that as well. And you also talked about skipping, and I want to hear a little more about skipping, because you know, I think part of the challenge we face as women is this the hierarchy, you know, and climbing these hierarchies or participating in hierarchies which may not always feel aligned with our whys. And I think sport falls into that trap sometimes too, that some sports are more known, more valued, more. Tell me about skipping, because I often make fun of rowing in that we are going backwards in a boat. I mean, we can't even see where we're going, right? And it's a very obscure sport. But it doesn't matter what you're doing, you know, whether you're playing the cello or going backwards in a boat or skipping, it's about something else, right? That attracts us to it. Can you tell us more about skipping and what it taught you?
Sure. Well, skipping was fun. And I think that we probably jump over that piece when we talk about sport. You know, we go to these very serious topics and analyze things, but it was fun. We were kids. It was skipping rope. It was going as fast as we can. It was, you know, learning tricks. It was goofing around with our ropes and the brakes. It was really just, you know, it was what we did twice a week. And, you know, we came together with friends. It cut across grades. You know, there were kind of age cohorts, but we were all from the same school, or, you know, a few community schools. And you would skip with people who were different ages than you, and we cheered one another on and things like that. And it was, again, like you say, rowing backwards in a boat, skipping. So like one of the disciplines is just how many rope turns can you do in 60 minutes? And we would work on perfecting that. I frankly was not the best. That was my strength. But, you know, you'd stand in one place and turn that rope as fast as you can, and you'd have people click, 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 clicking to see how many you could get. But it was wonderful. And then we'd all load up in a 15-passenger van and we'd go off and do demonstrations at other schools. But as I think back on it now, also with the lens of like gender equity, which I really have come into through this work, I think about the fact that we had women coaching. And so, which I guess maybe wasn't such a big segue because it was within the school environment and we had women teaching and women coaching. It just felt very natural at the time. But now I learn just how rare that is. And in fact, I was fortunate to have women coaches at many stages and in many sports that I played. And that is a really, really rare experience for a lot of women in sport. But for me, really just reinforced that women are leaders and that can lead anywhere. And again, that's a message that too few people get in their sport experiences.
And what do you see as the real implication or the challenges associated with that? We often hear, well, if you can see it, you can be it. There's value in being able to see yourself in the role and imagine yourself. But talk a little bit more about that for you.
I think it's important in having these conversations, to look outside of sport as well. Sport can be a little bit insular, a little bit inward looking, but it's part of our society. And when you consider women fighting for place in politics and the barriers that they're coming up against, and women fighting for place on corporate boards and corporate leadership roles, and I mean, pretty much every space within our society, women are still trying to gain respect and recognition and opportunities. Sport is very similar. What I think sport has to offer is a couple of things. You talked about in sport and through sport. So within sport, having women in leadership roles does a few things. For one thing, women aren't content to just participate in things that men create. We want to be at the table shaping them too. And we know from the research that creates more inclusive outcomes for everybody, that expands the spaces that are available. We do have a system that was built by men and for men. That's the history of sport. And women have made major contributions, but we still have a masculine legacy within sports that we need to start to unpack. And if we're going to do that, we need women at the table, as well as other underrepresented groups, because it's not just male, it is also predominantly white, and so on. And so if we want to change the system so that is more inclusive for everybody, we need those voices right there at the table. Not to mention, it's better for sport. Sport has a real challenge ahead of it. I don't think I need to go into too much detail on that, but we know when we look at the statistics that participation in sport has been declining year over year for a long time. COVID, of course, has made that more acute. And if we want sport to continue to feel relevant and valuable to the lives of Canadians, and a thriving place where Canadians see themselves belonging and through which they achieve their personal goals, we need to make sure that we are making it as inclusive of as many Canadians as we can. I think the price of exclusion is that sport will continue to decline in relevance to Canadians. And that, of course, as sport-loving people, is something that we would hate to see. We also talk a lot about safe sport. We know that having women in leadership roles create safer environments for everyone by creating checks and balances within the sport environment. And there's research that shows that boys who grow up with women leaders in sport learn to respect and recognize women's leadership, and to accept it and welcome it in other spaces in life as well. So it really starts to translate out of sport. And then more broadly, when we see women leading in the sport environment, we get women who then aspire to be leaders there and to translate it elsewhere. We know that sport really challenges a lot of the broader societal norms that exist around gender. And the more that we can push the envelope within sport, the more we can see that benefit society at large.
Yes, and difficult to challenge societal norms or cultural biases when we've also, as women, have grown up within them.
Oh, yes.
Right? Sport being created for men by men. And it's difficult to even question what might be changed because we just assume this is how it is. So I'd love to, let's just go there. We can jump all over. I'm taking notes so I can come back to things, because there were 6 questions I have out of just what you just said. But how do we, what's working for you? Because I know you're doing work around this too, to acknowledge some of those biases that we might be falling into as women, but need to recognize in order to shift and expand our conceptualization of sport.
You talk about biases, and I'll just pick up on that as a jumping off point. And I feel like I'm living this journey as much as anybody else, in the sense that I've not gone through my life with a gender lens on. There's a lot of experiences that now I'm able to reflect back on with that lens and go, oh, that was great, or oh, that I can see how that kind of just played into some stereotypes or what have you. But really having that gender lens, I think, is part of how we start to unpack this. If we look at things just without factoring gender, so just gender neutral, it's not part of how we assess and decide on things, then we're missing some real opportunities to create environments and experiences that are equitable, that can specifically advance the inclusion of women and girls such that they can access the same benefits or similar benefits as men and boys have. So bringing that gender lens to our work is increasingly something that we as an organization are working on, and that others in other fields are also working on. Because I think what's really true is that we're not going to see the kind of widespread system change that we need and want if it's a handful of leaders and a handful of organizations that are working on this. Where we really, when we know our job is done, is when every coach, administrator, board member, you name it, official, you name it, is able to put on that gender lens as they're doing their day-to-day work within sport or volunteering within sport, and to say, how do I make this work for women and girls? How do I make sure that they're not bumping up against barriers that I can influence in removing from the experience? And I think that it's then that we're really going to see that transformation that we're ultimately looking for. Now, no doubt that's a tall order. Systems change is big, and it's not a one generation project. But I really believe that this is how we ultimately are going to create that change. And there's lots of mechanisms for getting there, but the idea of having everybody capable and committed to applying that gender lens and being really intentional around inclusion, not just from a thought process, but from an action process, is where we're going to see the real shifts.
What are some of the initiatives that CWS is working on, Canadian Women in Sport are working on to create that intentionality, to really wake up all those participants in sport and beyond to the lens, to committing to the lens? Like, it's one thing to know about it, it's another to put those glasses on. What do you think is working? What are you noticing is working so far? When you said we can't have it in a generation, I'm thinking, why not? Determined, but I get it.